Good morning, everyone. My name's Charlie Humphreys from Asia House. I'll be introducing our sessions this morning. Thank you to Minister Iswaran for that fascinating discussion. We will be shortly starting our first panel on the outlook for global trade. And as you heard with the discussion there, US-China trade tensions being one of the major issues within that discussion. But of course, it's a very complex situation. We've got a lot of other issues to think about and look at, situation in Hong Kong and the impact on the wider region, the South Korea-Japan trade dispute, which in other circumstances would probably be getting much more coverage, and of course the slowdown economically in China and around the world, and concerns about a global recession and the impact on trade. So a great deal, including the regional comprehensive economic partnership, lots to think about. Maybe that will be less of a region and less comprehensive. We'll see. Our panel I'd like to introduce. We have Barbara Weisel, who's Managing Director of Rock Creek Global Advisors. And Barbara was also USTR for Southeast Asia and the Pacific during the Obama administration and Chief Negotiator on the TPP during that time. Victor Gao is Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization in Beijing, also an advisor to Saudi Aramco. Ruth Herkes, former State Secretary at the Federal German Ministry of Economic Affairs and Energy. She's also on the Asia House Advisory Board. And Victor Chu, Chairman and CEO of First Eastern Investment Group. It's a Hong Kong-based leading international investment firm. And Victor is a pioneer of private equity investments in China, which is also on the Asia House Advisory Board. Straight after the panel, we'll follow up with a session with Stuart Gulliver, who was the Group CEO of HSBC until last year. Just want to thank our sponsors, Accenture, Arup, and Pfizer, for today. And with that, I'll hand over to the panel.
Thanks, Charlie. Let's get straight underway. The Minister was fairly positive about the China-US trade conflict and the Phase 1 deal. Barbara Weisel, do you share that optimism?
I thought it was interesting that he posed it as a glass half full or glass half empty. I think I'm on the slightly glass.
Empty?
I'm not empty, but I'm emptier. I think that when you look at the negotiations that are underway and the effort to reach a deal that has not yet been struck, it's obviously a positive thing that there will be a deal. A deal is better than no deal. No tariffs, no additional tariffs are better than additional tariffs. So in that regard, it's a good thing. I think when you look at the deal overall, though, what's concerning is that the Trump administration went into this with very broad ambitions of what it was going to tackle in the negotiations, and to look at structural issues that are really at the heart of what's causing the conflict between the two countries. And this deal is of a much more transactional nature. And some of those issues are important. The Chinese government will enshrine some of the market access that it had been planning to provide anyway. It will increase purchases of many US products. But the structural issues really that were at the heart are not in the deal. So I think that's a concern. And where that leads to is the question of, has it created certainty? The big concern I think many companies have about the US-China trade frictions is the uncertainty that it's caused in the global economy and the impact that it's had around the world. So the question is, will this increase certainty? And I think that that's a very much of an open question. If this deal is supposed to lead to a Phase 2, but that Phase 2 doesn't occur, and we're in the middle of a US election campaign, will that lead to the inclination for additional tariffs or other friction that destabilizes things after we think that we've reached some sort of equilibrium? And lastly, it hasn't touched what's really at the heart, and what has emerged from this is the tech war.
Yes.
And the tech war really hasn't been touched here. If anything, I think that the tech war is expanding, and there are measures being announced every day by either the administration or Congress, and then reciprocated by the Chinese government that will remain in the wake of whatever settlement is reached, and none of that has really been addressed. So I think, as I said, I think it's a good thing that there won't be more tariffs, but the issues really remain to be addressed.
Yeah. Victor Gao, would you go along with that? The key issues really aren't going to be covered here, and therefore the potential for more uncertainty, more volatility, a descent into more tension is high.
Well, I think it's important to note that the greatest certainty in the world today is the uncertainty of the United States. That's really troubling. And it really happened in recent history. And the greatest predictability today is also the unpredictability of the current administration in Washington. And I think from the Chinese perspective, this is very worrisome. I think ever since the establishment of diplomatic relations between China and the United States, China has always dwelt each of the US president very seriously. And now it seems that this whole presumption is unraveling. And what's going on in Washington really creates a lot of uncertainty and unpredictability. And it's not only difficult for China to understand, and it's probably also very difficult for the whole world to understand. Now, allow me to say several things. Trade war is bad. It's bad for China. It's bad also for the United States. It's bad for the whole world. And also, I think the American people would at least need the decency of understanding how these tariffs are all being paid. It's not being paid by China. It's being paid by the American importers or consumers. Secondly, the damage on China is collateral. It's not the frontal direct damage by Chinese government paying all these tariffs. There will be closure of factories in China, but given the size and the magnitude of the Chinese economy, I think China can withstand all these blows. Therefore, the presumption that the American government will win the trade war against China is a fallacy. China will not buckle under the current trade war, and I think for China to surrender to the US pressure will be probably the collapse of the Chinese government. So there will be no way for China to succumb to the US pressure. A final point, allow me to add, I think during our lifetime, for everyone in this audience, China and the United States will remain the two largest economies in the world. It's better for us to get along with each other rather than getting to each other's throat. And I think this is probably the only way out. Decoupling is not going to happen. Why? Decoupling for the United States, walking away from China, will mean the closure of the China market for the American companies and American products and services. This in itself, if it ever happens, will be an economic suicide for the US economy. So don't push for decoupling and don't believe that decoupling will happen. These two countries need to get along with each other. Whether they like each other or not, that's another thing, but they have no way out to decouple from each other.
So no decoupling, but the issue from the China perspective is the volatility, the unpredictability of the US administration. We'll come back to that later, and Barbara, I definitely want to ask you about that, because from my recent trip to Washington, there was certainly a sense throughout, well, both political parties, a robust take on China is important. But Victor, let me come to you now. Business is caught in the crossfire here, aren't they? They're taking a hit from the trade war. How do you position yourself as a business given the uncertainty of the outcome of the trade conflict?
I think to add on what my learned friends have said on the panel, I think we all suffer in a trade dispute. The private sector will be second guessing whether we're going to have a major winter of discontent or there's a little bit of life breathing out of a round one consensus. And we're going to withhold a lot of the investment decisions. So that with the uncertainties, continued uncertainty of Brexit and some of the new trouble spots around the world, it really makes me worry about FDI across the board. So market is rising ahead of reality right now. And I think once we get to the winter, it's going to sink in. And then we have to remember that we have impeachment hearings coming out fairly soon. That will also be disruptive. And the US-China trade war, we say it's trade war, but in fact, it's a structural struggle right now between the two giants on the possibly some of the structural challenges, also supremacy of the tech sector, and who's going to prevail in the fourth industrial revolution, what are the standards we're going to subscribe on the red lines. So all these will sink in into Christmas and New Year. And if the round one of the trade agreement cannot be concluded by, let's say, Davos, I think we are going to have some serious repercussions, because all these different conflicts coming together. And so the next Chinese New Year may not be, we won't say Kong Hee Fat Choi necessarily unconditionally.
So certainly a complicated landscape with lots of factors at play. And Ruth, let's turn to the European view. There's some comments from European officials earlier this week, concern about China not having space for them, the bandwidth to deal with them because they're so consumed with the US. And there's certainly a fractious relationship between Europe and the US in this current climate. Is this an opportunity for Europe to do more business in China? Where does Europe sit in this?
So Europe inherently has always benefited from dealing with China, from investment both ways. We continue currently to be caught up in the trade dispute between the US and China because both countries, both economies are major trading partners for us. If you look at Europe's major corporations, I don't think there is any alternative then to do business with China but to highlight what my esteemed American colleague mentioned previously, the structural issues such as creating a level playing field that really can be called that, such as addressing the intellectual property rights, addressing more equality of market access, and forced technology transfer. But as you know, Europe is consumed with a number of issues at home, and we might come back to that. But let me also sound a more positive note in sync with the minister's very enlightened speech. If you look at the nature of trade deals and nature of policy, trade policy making, I think we take the temperature of markets. Markets were up yesterday on the news that we are going to have a Singapore EU FTA, which always has been a crown jewel among the EU's bilateral FTAs around the world. And I wanted to congratulate the government of Singapore for making that possible. Number two, RCEP. Although India opted out for at least now, it covers nearly 1/3 of global GDP. It has as its members all ASEAN countries, China, Korea, Japan, and the United States. I think this is fabulous. It has to be, of course, put into concrete steps, but it is fabulous news. Equally, the Chinese president at the trade fair in Shanghai saying China is open for business. This is what we want to hear. Now, we have to turn it into more concrete steps, and it has to, get some reality on the ground. But this is what we need and where we want to be. We live in an interdependent world. That is what we wanted. We have to shape that world. That comes with an inherent amount of insecurity, instability, moving parts, but that is what we want. And we heard it from the minister this morning who said populism, retreating, bifurcation are no options.
Barbara, the view I took out of various discussions in Washington recently was that both political parties want to take a robust position on China, and that the tensions, which will, the core issues, will remain for 10 years. this is a long-term play by the US to take that position. Is that your take?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, that's quite clear, and as you watch developments unfold, you can see one party is trying to take positions more extreme than the other and to demonstrate their hard line on China. I mean, I think it gets, though, to the core of something my colleague said here, that there are some real issues here that need to be grappled with. If you peel away the layers of the politics here, what is underlying the discontent and the discomfort are real issues. You know, the intellectual property theft, the cyber theft, the fact that much of the Chinese economy is not covered by global trade rules, and as the Chinese government strengthens its control and the role of SOEs in the market and the way that they compete globally, that creates real disequilibrium in the global economy that needs to be dealt with in a meaningful way. Each government can decide how they want to organize themselves, but if we're all going to have a global trading system that works, we can't have economies that have large segments of those economies not covered by the same rules. You can't have situations where markets are open across many parts of the world, but there's not reciprocity in other markets. So I think it's great that we're hearing out of Chinese officials that they're looking to improve trade relations and they want to open the market, but it does need to be followed up with really concrete steps or it becomes, you know, empty words.
And President Xi did say this week, committed to the market reforms already outlined, but there's a clear position out of the US that they have to happen. Are they going to happen? Will China reform and at a pace that will accommodate some of the requests, wishes from the US?
I would say for the last 41 years, China has always been reforming itself, politically as well as economically. Without reform of major reforms in China, how can you explain that the Chinese economy has made so much transformation? 41 years ago, China's GDP was equivalent to that of India. Today, China is about 5 times as big as India's GDP. And I would say the one small anecdote is that in India you have the commission of the Central Planning Commission. 41 years ago, in China, the equivalent ministry is also called the Central Planning Commission. But now, over the past 4 decades, it keeps changing its name. Now it's called the National Reform and Development Commission. So I would say this is one small example to show that reform is a must. Without reform, without innovation, without opening to the outside world, without really work hard on your most important things, you cannot achieve development like that. And I think the fact that CIIE, the second China International Import-Expo being held in Shanghai as we speak, is another innovative endeavor for China. No other country in history has ever held such import exposition. And I think it's a big sign to show that China is open, China wants to trade. Now, for China-US, I think the huge trade imbalance is not sustainable. But the imbalance is not because of there is no market for American products and services in China. The Chinese demand for US goods and services is huge, but there are artificial reasons on the US side not to export or not to sell as many goods to China going forward. So I actually advocate a more balanced approach to China-US trade, and both countries need to work very hard to increase US export to China, rather than, for example, slapping tariffs on the Chinese export to the United States. The trade war, in real essence, is the wrong war for China and the United States to be engaged in. It's mutually destructive. It's not good for China. It's not good for the United States. And I think both China and the United States need to reform. And putting the trade war behind us will be the only right approach for China and the United States.
Victor, the pace of reform in China, you're active in business. Is it fast enough?
Absolutely. I want to echo to what Victor said. I've been in China for more than 35 years, both as a lawyer and as an investor. And obviously, it's a work in progress. I mean, China started at a very low base. But the progress is made both in terms of intellectual property protection and in terms of, for example, environmental standards. It's night and day, from what we went in 30-odd years ago. The environmental standards in China, in practice, is much tougher than, let's say, many Western countries today. The intellectual property protection, again, is night and day. Today, there are more Chinese patent registrations than the rest of the world combined. So that vested interest have provided robustness of the intellectual property protection. A lot of the complaints with respect are historical. A lot of the complaints about intellectual property protection and intellectual theft, that probably happened 30, 20 years ago. But today, if you go into China, it is a different environment. Now, as I mentioned, China is a big country. We can't expect to arrive Rome in one day. It's still a progress. But the progress is enormous. If you come into Beijing today, you see blue sky. If you go into Beijing today, you don't hear a driver honking at the cars. In the past, whenever there's traffic jam, it's insufferable, very well behaved. So I think that is really a game changer, which probably some of the policy makers, our friends around the world, have not really feel that buzz. For those of us who go into China today, we feel that the reform really has delivered good for the people on the street, and that's very encouraging. And I hope with encouragement and pressure from our good friends around the world, China get better and better.
We are very happy to take questions from the audience. So if you'd like to ask a question, please just put your hand in the air and we'll bring around a mic to you. So think about it and I'll come back to you in a moment. But Anne Ruth, it's the tech front where this is really going to play out, is it not? The tensions between the US and China?
Yes, it is. That's to a certain degree. The trade war is really about technology and supremacy. It's about the famous 5G case where at least one European country and the US have gone in a different direction. It certainly is. I think we need both. I think we need the technological advances, inventions, innovation and research in both countries. I'm not afraid that the US might leave its leading position in that. I think a wise policy would be to encourage, as my friend said earlier, encourage China to further open up, to become even more transparent, to engage as we do. I'm happy to address the Huawei case, but certainly markets need both technological cultures.
Move on to a couple of other things now. RCEP, it's not seen as a high-quality trade deal, but is it significant or is it symbolic?
Well, it's a significant achievement that the countries, 15 or 16, however many will be ultimately in the deal, have concluded a trade agreement amongst themselves. I mean, that in and of itself is a significant achievement. I think it's hard to comment on the quality of the deal since we haven't seen it yet.
Yeah.
But based on what has been publicly established about the deal, it does seem to be a lower quality in terms of rules than the CPTPP or the TPP was. And I think that it reflects a different approach by those countries to the way they think about negotiations. So they think about negotiations, let's start with a manageable level of rules and then we'll eventually raise the standard. And I think others in the US was and is in this camp is that let's set the standards that we're looking for, and if some countries have difficulty meeting them at the beginning, at the outset of the deal, then let's find some flexibility for them to reach those standards. I think ultimately the important part of this will actually not be the rules. It will be the market access.
Yeah.
And the market access in that you had all of these individual bilateral deals or ASEAN plus one deals now all under one set of rules, one agreement, one set of rules of origin that will help reinforce the supply chains in the region, and the rules, I think, you know, they're there, and when we see them, we'll know
Yeah.
how high
Yes.
standard they are. But I think ultimately it'll be more of a goods agreement. And yet when I think about TPP, I think it was about market access, but it was very much about setting rules that were high standard.
Yeah. Victor, how's it seen in China? A significant victory for multilateral trade?
I think we need to congratulate these 15 countries for reaching more or less agreement on the documentation, at least, for the RCEP agreement. For China, I think this is a big event because China is a big advocate for more trade, greater globalization, and more free trade among countries. And I think China is very eager to promote all these mechanisms. And China believes that with the world more and more and better connected, it will be a safer world, and this will be a recipe for more development in the world. China does not want to hide behind any walls or barriers. And I think you will see China more and more coming out of China and really stretch out its hand to reach all corners of the world, not as a threat, but as a globalizer in a sense. And I think RCEP hopefully will welcome India's participation. And I think the more you stay out of RCEP for India, the less potential for the India economy to generate more growth potentials. So we hope India will come in.
Okay. Open up now to questions, please. If you'd like to ask a question. Steve. Microphone will be coming, I hope. Microphone, please. Yeah, here it comes. Just name an organization, please.
Steve Oken with McClarty Associates. I mean, the decoupling of China in the world really is best illustrated by Made in China 2025, which came out well before Trump in 2015, where China set forth how it's going to use the power of the state to dominate the key industries of the 21st century, setting specific quotas for where Chinese companies were going to have, you know, market dominance in China for artificial intelligence, renewable vehicles, you know, responsible agriculture. And so what is it going to take for China to no longer use its structural dominance to address the issues that the world has with China? Sure, Trump's policies of unilateral tariffs may not be the way to address it, but what is it going to take to get that level playing field so that we can get out of this trade war?
Now, first of all, I think the Chinese structure is unique. And each year, China graduates about 7 million to 8 million college graduates, and among which there will be about more than 1 million graduates with engineering degrees. And China is the biggest country sending its students abroad to the United States, to European countries, etc., here to Singapore, for example, to study. And have you seen any other country which sends out its incumbent government officials at all levels to study, to be trained in Singapore, for example, or in many universities in the United States? Therefore, I think for China to keep innovating and to keep climbing up the ladder is inevitable. No one can stop that. And I think, according to my personal information, there is a big pipeline in China where more and more groundbreaking technologies are coming out of the pipeline. So in the coming 3 to 6 months, for example, you may learn about major breakthroughs in the hydrogen-based power source in China. And it will be really cutting edge. It will be in the top of the world. So don't be surprised if China keeps innovating. And allow me to say, the more pressure you put onto China, the more so-called sealing off and decoupling attempts against China, it will probably only reinforce the Chinese resilience in developing self-reliance. And I think the current technological war between China and the United States, and China is on the receiving side of this war again, probably will accelerate China's push into self-reliance. And I've said on another occasion, in the semiconductor business, for example, if the United States keeps withholding these technologies or equipment to China, the US semiconductor industry itself in 10 to 15 years' times may be out of business. Why? Because they are abandoning a market which in any particular year would pay about $300 billion US to buy these semiconductor chips from the United States. So if you cut out China as the biggest buyer of all these semiconductor products from the United States, what will be the viability of that business in the United States? Therefore, I think the technological war, like the trade war, is bad for China, but also bad for the United States. I think going forward, we need to have more openness in promoting a more open and more transparent, a fairer market for China and the United States. And I think the Chinese innovation drive is a real one. And I think the push for advancing on the technological advancement in China is a real one. It cannot be stopped.
Got time for a couple more questions. So, the microphone, please. Yeah.
Good morning. Peter Godfrey of the Energy Institute. Firstly, I'd like to back what Victor has just talked about and specifically talk about energy and infrastructure. Are we in danger when we start talking about these global trade issues that we're kind of blaming the international trading mechanism instead of looking internally at our own? And back to Minister Iswaran's points this morning about looking at, for example, digitalization strategy, for example, clean energy, sustainable energy strategy, as issues that are internal problems for countries to deal with. Are we not blaming the international trading mechanism too much at the expense of dealing with a lot of the policies ourselves, either from a regional and national point of view? So my comment here is really about saying, yes, if we look at technologies in China, particularly when we talk about renewable energy technology, new energy technology, in many cases, there are things happening in China today that are world leaders. And this interface are issues that we need to discuss at a sectoral level and at an internal level, as opposed to worrying about the global trade dynamics as much as we're doing.
Okay, but I want to come to you on this and also the previous question on technology.
I mean, I think that the answer to your question, and as the minister said, is that each country needs to develop its own affirmative policy for what it's trying to do in the world. If a country wants to be competitive, they have to have their own strategy for being competitive, regardless of what's going on in the rest of the world, and that's true. But where I take issue here is the discussion here on the role that China's played, and I think the question that Steve asked wasn't actually answered, that there are barriers and structural issues in the Chinese market that are real, that need to be dealt with, that are a cause of instability in the global trading system. It may be that 30 years ago there was no intellectual property protection, and now there's improved intellectual property protection. But there's still intellectual property theft of a significant proportion that is not dealt with. But beyond intellectual property, it's things like investment restrictions, equity caps, all kinds of areas where China can invest in the rest of the world, but the rest of the world can't invest in China. Where state-owned enterprises can have government subsidies to their businesses that allow them to compete in third markets, and then the rest of the world is playing on a different playing field. And those are real issues that will not, we're not going to find ourselves in a situation globally where we're going to be able to operate fairly if these issues aren't seriously confronted. it's great that China's out there talking about openness and transparency and welcoming the rest of the world, but there are issues here that are going to prevent the resolution of the underlying issues that are causing these trade frictions, not just between the US and China, but between China and many other countries around the world.
Okay, we've got time for one quick question because we're running out of time. So.
Tommy Barchikov, Avenir. I have a question. Victor Chu talked about the patent explosion in China, which I have also looked at, and it's amazing. Victor Gao also talked about China's development. Kai-Fu Lee was here last year talking about AI and how the Chinese government has access to tons of data, which is the base for development. Now, if it is like this, I foresee that within 5-10 years, the US will be begging to buy licenses from Chinese companies because they need them. How will the Chinese and the Americans look at that situation? Because then the trade in licenses will be reversed, perhaps.
Do you see a reversal in that?
First of all, I think when the minister and other panelists talk about the digital economy, my personal view is that in the China market, there is the creation of probably one of the largest pool of data on a daily basis, and it's evolving, it's snowballing. So I would say if we really think about the future of the digital economy, the Chinese digital economy will be one of the biggest and one of the most important digital economy. That's number one. Number two is that China has adopted a very interesting policy. On the one hand, it still does not allow YouTube or Facebook, all these portals, etc., to flourish in China. But on the other hand, I don't think there are any other countries' governments more flexible and more willing to promote digital economy. Why? Because look at e-payment, for example. Look at all the new experiments in the digital economy. China is, again, leading the world in the right direction, even though privacy protection, etc., is another issue that needs to be better addressed in China. But I would say this approach to embrace the new economy, to embrace the digital economy in China, will lay a more solid foundation in China for the experiments, for innovation, and for, as you mentioned, RPR protections. I would say without RPR protection, there will be no innovation and there will be no future to any country's economy. So don't be surprised if one day China becomes the largest and the most important champion for the protection of RPR rights, and partially for its own sake, because China generates more RPR rights now than the United States. It's amazing. So I would not be surprised if one day, for example, US will come to China to ask for cooperation. The space station, which China will launch in about 2 years, will be the only working space station for a period of time, because the International Space Station will be out of business for a while, and I will not be surprised if the US government or the US Congress will need to change its laws, not only allowing US cooperation with China in the outer space, but also probably begging China for opportunities to use the Chinese space facilities for the help of the US businesses in the future.
But data is a big part of this, and China does own the data, which gives it a huge advantage, as Kai-Fu Lee was saying last year, you alluded to that, in terms of developing AI and other technical products. Is the US at a disadvantage there?
I mean, there's a lot of debate about this subject, and I think that the literature shows that there are advantages in some areas and other areas where other countries are competitive, and I think it's just an evolving situation right now, and it's hard to determine. I mean, there are advantages to having a lot of the data, controlling the data, and the government, as I say, has national champions that it is developing in order to compete globally, and I think that's at the heart of it. But I guess I wouldn't write off the rest of the world, because I think the rest of the world is very competitive in many other areas.
Victor Chu, final word to you. Digital economy, a big theme of this conference, and China, in many respects, very advanced in terms of its digital economy. Is that going to be the cornerstone of Chinese economy going forward, the digital economy?
I like to sound a caution here, because the best scenario is that we accept diversity, inclusion, and celebrate globalization so that we can cross-fertilize and everybody benefit from everybody else leapfrogging technology for the benefit of mankind. But the difficulty is the faster that China runs in technology, the faster we will make this containment psyche, which is uniting Washington's consensus, faster. So you have a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we have to really calm down and come to our senses that there is a multilateral system in place. It's by no means perfect, but that's the best and the least discriminatory system we have. And I think that's where the issue is. We have to be very careful. As Victor said, China is determined to go its own way, that it feels right to develop technology to benefit its own country and its neighbors. But the psyche from outside is that China wants to dominate. So this is something that we have to manage and be careful. And big data probably is also the trigger.
So I'm afraid we have to leave it there. In fact, we've run over time. It's been a terrific discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking my panelists, Barbara Weisel, Victor Chu, Victor Gao, and Ruth.